Hi, I'm Dr Paula Redmond, a clinical psychologist, and you're listening to the When Work Hurts podcast. On this show, I want to explore the stories behind the statistics of the mental health crisis facing healthcare professionals today, and to provide hope for a way out through compassion, connection, and creativity. Join me as I talk to inspiring clinicians and thought leaders in healthcare about their unique insights and learn how we can support ourselves and each other when work hurts. For this final episode of this current season, I spoke with Dr Libby Nugent, who is a clinical psychologist who works psychoanalytically with both individuals and groups. She's done a lot of work with NHS staff and in thinking about the conscious and unconscious dynamics of working within healthcare. I began by asking her what a psychoanalyst is.
Good question to start on. I think it's a good question to start on because I think it's quite confusing, that there's so many different terms on a psychologist, psychotherapist, psychoanalyst, and it can feel just a bit disorientating. I suppose for me, what psychoanalyst means is someone who is interested in patterns in relationships, patterns in relationships that normally start when you're quite young. So the first relationships that we have are with our parents or caregivers and our family members. And we only know what we know. We only know those patterns. And as we get older, we kind of go to new environments, meet new people, and we often find ourselves repeating those patterns. A really important part of, psychoanalysis and what makes it a little bit different from other types of talking therapies is that we're really interested in something called the unconscious. And all that means is the bits of the patterns that we do that we're not aware that we do. Or I guess a different way of thinking about it might be, I might know what I need to do to lose weight. I might know that I just need to exercise and eat less, and it's really straightforward. And yet I can't quite do it. and there's a bit in me that I suppose psychoanalysts would say that's just not conscious. It doesn't know why it does what it does. And I might think, I just need to write a better list, or I might need to get a better motivation, and yet I still can't quite do it. So that's really what psychoanalysis is about looking at patterns and also at looking at why we keep doing the things that we're doing, even though sometimes we don't want to.
One of the reasons I wanted to talk to you was what I noticed in my work and in myself is that as a health professional, our relationship with our work can be quite complicated and problematic. And just when you were talking there, I was thinking, we can find ourselves doing things, being stuck in patterns, keeping going, even when we don't want to, and even when we know it hurts us. So I'd be really curious to kind of hear your thoughts about what's going on there.
Well, probably all sorts of things depending on the person. I think work's a really good place for us to go to look at, why we keep doing certain things, even though, 10 minutes earlier we were saying we were never going to do it again. So I'm never going to take another patient on, or I'm going to make sure I take that lunch break, or I'm absolutely going to leave work on time. I'm going to talk to that person and tell them exactly what I feel, and yet 10 minutes later it's we're back in the puddle on the floor thinking, gosh, what just happened there? Or maybe telling ourselves, oh, it'll be better this time. It'll be okay, just this once. And I think, a lot of my work is really working with healthcare professionals, either through kind of reflective spaces, or sometimes I do some work with the practitioner health service. And these situations come up a lot for people. They just do, where there's a sort of rational bit or a conscious bit that knows work isn't working. And yet it's really, really difficult to do it differently. And it can activate some really strong emotions in people, actually. You know, I think working in healthcare professions, and I'm sure this will apply to kind of other occupations as well, but I think there's something particular about healthcare professions, and there's something particular about the NHS within that. You know, many of us just are there for restorative reasons. We want to help, we want to make a difference, we care. And then we find ourselves in this place where we're not quite caring and helping the way we know how to. And yet we can't do it differently. And the bind is to walk away from that. It's not just walking away from a job. It's not just walking away from, something that pays the bills. It's trying to walk away from a part of yourself, from a part of your identity, maybe a part of your childhood, if you're in a profession where you kind of grew up, you know, in it, like medicine or nursing or psychology. And it's really, really painful, actually. It's really painful and can leave people in a lot of internal conflict where they kind of might know what they need to do, but they just can't quite do it, and yet staying is unbearable.
And I suppose I'm wondering, as you were talking about, you know, what the unconscious reasons are that we might go into this job that might be part of that conflict.
Well, I think, I mean, and again, I don't know if this would apply to everybody. I think that would be quite a lot of hubris, but I certainly think for lots of people there's this idea of restoration, and I think a lot of people who want to help have grown up needing to help in some way, needing to be helpful, and that being helpful was something that wasn't really necessary for the person caring for them. So if I just kind of keep it in a very simple story and say maybe it's about mum's not been very supported, maybe she's not been appreciated or valued enough, and the child learns I can help, I can be helpful to mum. And if one of the ways that we learn to be helpful is to be quiet, maybe, or we learn to sit in the corner while she's busy and not play, or we learn to be polite and play nicely, or we learn to, you know, if she's working long shifts, and, you know, we learn that we don't need as much company, that we're okay by ourselves, or that we don't need to eat when we're hungry, we can just wait a little bit longer, or wait till there's more food in the cupboards when there's a bit more money. You know, you learn to put things on pause and to prioritise something more important, which is maybe the whole family, the family as a group, or mum in particular. And you learn that, you know, if mum's just supported properly, everything would be okay because mum's great. And that's the story you keep being given, and so not necessarily consciously, but unconsciously, you have this pattern of, in order to receive love, something has to be kind of removed or killed off or delayed or denied in some way. Now, we have a culture that I think, again, I should say I'm interested in two different types of psychology. One is something called Jungian psychology, which is very interested in aspects of creativity and in storytelling and how stories exist in big groups, in collectives, in society. And the other psychology I'm interested in, which I'm training in, is group analysis. And that's very much this idea that everybody is naturally social. And both of those psychologies are interested in language and in talking. And they're both interested in stories. And the reason why I've kind of taken that detour a little bit is to kind of explain a little bit about how our society has stories about mothers. And it used to be a long time ago that mothers were quite sort of ambivalent characters in stories. So you might have a story like Hansel and Gretel, which lots of people are familiar with. And the original kind of versions of that story, because it's really old, it was just a mother. It was a mother, it was time of famine, and a mother said, the children have to go out into the woods, we can't feed them anymore, which would have been a very real situation. And that would be a dilemma that mothers have, is how do you feed your children when you've got no food? And actually, if you die, then everybody dies. And really difficult choices. And the mother in that story grieves, and actually she dies at the end of it. You know, it's kind of a sad. Hansel and Gretel eventually get back home, but the mother's dead. The Grimm's brothers kind of took that story and they edited it a bit and changed it, and as a culture we changed the story, so it stopped being a natural mother, as in a birth mother, and it became a kind of wicked stepmother. A natural birth mother, it's sort of tricky language, isn't it? But a birth mother somehow wouldn't do that to her child, but a wicked stepmother would. Something kind of unnatural, unfeeling, uncaring. And it's the wicked stepmother that sends them out into the woods. And when she dies, it's a punishment at the end because she's terrible. And we kind of have kept bits of that story in our culture alive now. So, you know, we think that mothers are only good. And we talk about love. Love changes everything. If you look at all our songs and our music, we've got so much is about how love saves the world from everything. And that we don't really talk about the need for grief, the need for loss, the despair a mother might feel when she can't feed her children. We sort of imagine, it doesn't matter how much the government cuts funding or however much, you know, that somehow we'll keep surviving, we'll just keep going. Endurance and willpower are going to save the day. And collectively, we've kind of made unconscious the part of the mother that has to deny a child, the part of the mother that should rightfully be hated by the child. I mean, there's nothing likeable for that. And what we have now are mothers that are supposed to endlessly provide with nothing in the cupboard, and children that should only be grateful and shouldn't rage or protest. And you see that. Hopefully this isn't too much of a detour, but kind of you really see that in people's work culture, their attitude. You know, the NHS is a kind of mother, and it's a sort of part of the a sort of British family structure. You know, you're hard pushed to escape the NHS in this country. It's just she's everywhere, even if you don't use it directly, and most people do. Friends, family, colleagues use it, and we are very dependent on it, and lots of ways that's a really great thing. But she's also chronically underfunded and unsupported and politicised, and we all have an idea if the NHS could just be supported properly, then everything would be okay. And, you know, that's also a story we have. And to be the kind of children of the NHS, as in the staff that work there, when she's unsupported but not allowed to fail because she has to just be good, people end up in really tricky situations where they're left sort of hungry or sort of symbolically hungry, symbolically underfed, and they've got no place to take that.
And sometimes literally hungry and literally underfed, people not being able to meet their basic needs when they're at work, not being able to take time or having access to food, toilet breaks, water. Yeah,
but it's true. And you could kind of see it in the pandemic in a really literal way as well, you know, that it's certainly at the beginning where you know, NHS staff will be sent in and people were, you know, banging pots and saying thank you, and then they couldn't get into the supermarket to fill their cupboards. You know, we have a wish for caregivers to do without, and to just endurance and willpower that we call love, which is a sort of slightly perverse thing, but we call it love and care, that somehow that's going to save us all. But then the dilemma, though, which is very real, if you again look at the Hansel and Gretel story, there was a famine. And actually, the grief that a mother would have to go through to send her children away, I mean, it's sort of unthinkable. And actually, that's the dilemma I think a lot of staff have. They're literally, I've heard stories of people just being left with no one to call for support with a ward full of patients. And if you go home, there's no one to take over. If you're going home just to get some sleep, just to get some rest, who's going to take over? And it's impossible. It's such an impossible choice people are put into. There isn't an easy answer. Making things conscious actually is a task of being able to make pain conscious, and that's hard.
And Libby, I know that you've written about the NHS as death mother. Can you expand on that particular term?
So that's the death mother archetype. I mean, it's a really bold name, isn't it? It's quite a frightening one, though actually with the story I've told it just then, it's an apt one. There's a few different Jungian analysts that have talked about this archetype. Marion Woodman was the first one, and I think she did some joint work with Daniela Siefer, and Danielle Siefer's still very much kind of talking about this archetype, and there's someone called Violet Sherwood as well, who I think is in New Zealand, talks about it. And what it is it's a way of trying to describe this idea of what happens when we split mothering up. So it's kind of what I just described, really, about the kind of the state of mothering, or sometimes we call it the kind of the feminine being anything to do with nature or the body. We currently live in a period of time where we really don't value very much bodies or Mother Nature. We really prize kind of mind over matter attitudes. And, matter is another word of saying martyr, mother. And we really try and encourage kind of more and more science. And I'm very pro-science, so this might sound like an odd thing to say, but the more and more technology, more and more solutions to things. And the more we do that, the more we can kind of disconnect from how things actually work, where waste goes. We can create fantasies of living in pain-free societies, of there not being death, which are kind of the sort of necessary, but can create a disconnect. It's an odd sort of tension. And the death mother archetype is really, it's like what happens when we deny grief and pain and suffering and that part of life. And it's the bit that's just about endurance and willpower. And so I guess the phrase is, it's the shadow of nature. That's what always sticks in my head. It's the bit that that we don't see very clearly, that if we ignore what's real, what things actually cost. So an example of that might be, flying somewhere abroad and the holiday, and we can think about how relaxing that is and not really think about how it kind of hurts the environment. And I don't mean that in any kind of judgment way. It's just sort of speaking to something real. Or, we can talk about avocados being super healthy, and I live in kind of Shropshire, North Wales, and we don't grow avocados around here. So whilst it might be like really healthy for my body, I'm denying a big part of the story, which I can do because I don't know how it works. And the death mother is this archetype that's really kind of such, you don't need to know how things work. It's not important. You don't need to have a connection with the body or with nature or what's natural. We just need to do what we do and pretend it's all nice. That's the kind of, and there's probably more psychoanalytic kind of explanations than the one I've given, but that's kind of my working idea in my head that I go with.
It makes me think about what it's like to work in the NHS, and it's a lot like that kind of opaqueness of systems and the power structures. You're not really allowed to know what happens and where it goes.
An NHS example of that might be, you know, we have waiting lists for services, and people don't really sit and think, what does it feel like to be on a waiting list, a 2-3 year waiting list? We just think, oh, well, it happens. Poor them, you have to wait, bit uncomfortable, but we don't really think about the psychology of waiting and what that means to a person arriving. And the longer you have to wait, and I'm not saying no waiting either, because sometimes you have to wait. It's not about removing waiting lists, it's about understanding what's real in them. But the longer you wait, the more you're making it very clear that as a caregiver you are under-resourced. The more you are activating in a patient the idea that they probably need to behave, they probably need to be doing something to support their unsupported caregiver. It makes complaint quite difficult then. It makes it difficult to say when you finally get to the end of the queue, have you got anything else? Is there another person I can speak to, or maybe a better fit? Are you sure? Are you sure? Or if someone says, well, you can have this treatment, but it's going to take 12 months, or you have this treatment and it will be 3 weeks and you can get it from the pharmacy. All of us, you know, people want to be useful and not cause a bother to their kind of patient siblings. And that's an ethical problem. And it's a real ethical problem, you know, for mental health services particularly. But there's other services that we have that have these very, very long waiting lists. And people kind of being, I want to use the word declawed before they arrive.
It also creates the sense that, well, you're lucky to be here because there's so many other people who want and need this.
But it's the whole system, because this also hurts the clinicians. You know, the clinicians are making people wait. And one of the really kind of difficult things, because the NHS is a whole family, it really is. Clinicians are both patients and caregivers. It's much more about a sibling dynamic than it is actually about, you know, that your caregiver is actually your sibling. And so they are also wrestling with the feeling dependent, not being able to say no, where do you protest, kind of wanting to champion the more unwell sibling in that dynamic, but at the same time knowing that everybody needs care and nobody's quite getting enough. And it's really complicated, or it's a complex. There's a real kind of social complex going on for us around this.
And I can think of times when, you know, being aware of waiting lists and how terrible that feels to know that you're asking people to wait for so long, and knowing that people are suffering while they wait. But it's just overwhelming and paralyzing to go there.
And I guess you're making me think of another story, actually. So one of the stories that I sometimes think about when I think about the death mother archetype is I think about the story of Medusa. And I don't know if you know, she's a Greek goddess story, and she worked in a temple of Athena, who's the goddess of wisdom. And she's, I don't know, depending on which version you read, she's kind of either sexually assaulted or she's kind of overcome by this god. Either way, she's violated. And she's not very happy about it and protests, and she's punished, and she gets turned into a monster where her head is full of snakes, and whoever she looks at gets turned to stone. And in lots of ways we could say Medusa's kind of the embodiment of trauma. She's kind of, your head full of snakes. It's kind of squirrely. You don't know what's going around. I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this podcast, but it's kind of, snakes are a bit phallic, so you're a bit of a dickhead. It can be quite difficult to get close to. They bite, but hugely creative potential. All of that life. But when you get close to someone who's in a lot of suffering, as we're all inherently social, it's terrifying, it's petrifying. We turn to stone. And so it becomes very, very difficult. You've got trauma everywhere and everyone keeps being turned to stone. And that's the paralysing feeling that we often have, where we want to move towards something, but we don't know how. And then there's all this anger and rage that you might get located in certain clinicians or in certain patients. And you're just like, oh God, do they have to? Is often the feeling. It's a really emotionally numb feeling. It lacks such empathy, but that's the turning to stone bit.
That really resonates. And I guess that becomes, we could kind of operate in that mode for a bit. I can totally remember times and when I've, been managing people and said the same thing of, all we can do is what we can do. And that's kind of okay for a bit. But I guess then the discomfort sets in where you're not then able to be the good child because you're stuck. I'm reading with my son and we're reading the Percy Jackson book, so
yeah,
it's
amazing.
And the statues get turned to sand, like an annihilation is what it can feel like. And
I think annihilation is the right word. I think for some people, and particularly for staff, that have to leave, say, and I don't know if people always have to leave, but for people that have to leave, it can feel like an annihilation. It can feel like, it's not just work, it's your community, it's your friendship group, it's people that you grew up with. There's something very difficult about telling people you left the NHS. It's not a story that's, you can say with a lot of pride. I mean, it's really difficult. It can feel very shaming, and that somehow you were supposed to survive it. It's supposed to be survivable. And again, I think the NHS is very important, and I kind of signed up to protect the NHS, but I'm also signed up to reality about what it is that we're protecting and what people really do need to be sustained in environments that there is just not enough, where you will be letting people down, you will probably be being hated, certainly breaking people's hearts in terms of not giving them what you want to and maybe what they deserve, in inverted commas, it's really difficult.
And what about the aspect of, we've talked, I suppose, about, the patient care side, but when work is, really actively hurting us in terms of, brutal rotas, no breaks, a kind of exposure, lack of support, and it's also paralysing.
I think I'd probably turn to the Medusa story again for this. I very much, in the Medusa story, a hero is chosen to stop her. But he has to approach her in a particular way. You can't look at her directly, so he has this kind of shield that's so shiny you reflect in it, and so he kind of approaches just looking at the reflection, walking backwards, and eventually he gets there, and he's got very fast shoes. I think they're winged. And he gets there and he removes her head from her body, which is an interesting thing, and her body becomes transformed. Her body becomes transformed into this huge golden giant with a sword, which is kind of fight, I guess, and this winged horse, Pegasus. And Pegasus we associate, I guess, with fight. You've got fight and flight that have come out, so that's the kind of the movement of trauma into something a bit more functional. And Pegasus you also associate with poetry, kind of with creativity. And I think for me that's kind of, you have to learn how to pick your battles. You have to learn how to be connect to more a body part of the self, something more instinctual, which might be Pegasus, that kind of horse bit. That you have to, it can be incredibly important to kind of connect to creativity. And just something that's nourishing. I heard, and it's kind of cheesy, but I heard something recently where somebody was talking, they said we're not human doings, we're human beings. And learning how to just be, learning your value beyond usefulness is really vital. Connecting to the kind of animal part of ourselves that's a little bit less socialised. I don't know what the word would be. Yeah. So for me it's creativity, community, care, choice. They're the kind of the principles of it.
So I guess that kind of answers the question I wanted to ask you about how we respond to this stuff.
In terms of everyday stuff, I think the more we learn to speak honestly and not gaslight each other into pretending awful things are survivable or nice is probably the first step. It's remarkably difficult just to speak honestly about things. To say, I can't, and that's terrible, or something even worse, I don't want to. I don't want to stay in work any longer. I want to go home and watch Netflix, or I want to go home. I mean, there's something so almost blasphemous about that. You know, people have to come up with something worthy, as if just having any kind of life outside of work is not worthy, and you know, people have to, you know, throw their kids high in the air or throw their pets high in the air and say, look, I've got to take care of these other people, I'm useful away from here. You can't just say, actually, I just want to, I don't know, eat some cake and watch, I don't know, I'm trying to think what I've been watching recently, The Witcher, bit of Henry Cavill. Like, I can't, like what's wrong with that? But it is a terrible, I guess I'm saying it flippantly, but actually I suppose the reality is that it's wrong, someone would say, because somebody might die if you don't. And then why should I be watching Netflix and drinking coffee and eating cake when somebody's dying? And then you get in this very difficult sibling dilemma of whose life is worth more. And they're terrible, terrible choices. But the reality is, if we don't self-care at all, eventually there will be no caregivers left and it will all be gone. And that's dramatic, but actually people are leaving the NHS in big numbers now. It's really difficult. Or if people go back in, they're going in on contracts, you know, and then they get sort of scapegoated a bit because they're so expensive, or, you know, like all this kind of stuff that happens. And it's just so difficult.
So something about being able to voice that.
Yeah.
And maybe I can ask you about these other things that you mentioned. So you talked about creativity. That really resonates with me. That's one of my kind of strands of my work. I really feel that, you know, there's so many benefits. But I'm wondering if you could say more about that and what Jung might say about why it is so essential, why it's so important for us. Beyond the kind of, I don't know, it feels good and it's nice to do something pretty with stuff.
Well, I guess it's about eros, it's about life force. It's about, you know, psychology is the study, I guess, of soul or of breath, depending which translation you go. So psyche meaning, I think it means butterfly or breath or soul. And so it's the study of that. And the story of Psyche is that she falls in love with Eros, who's the son of Aphrodite, and then has to go on quite a battle to kind of because she betrays him and he runs away, and she has to go in quite a battle to kind of claim him back. And I think often work becomes soulless. I think work can become, people are drawn to it for love. It's a really, again, quite a simple way of thinking about it, but people want to give love. They want to care. And so this idea of soul and love coming together is important, because people go there to give love and to make a meaningful life, to have some soul in their life. And then that's not what happens, because work becomes soulless. So how do we create more soul in our lives? And I know this all sounds very flowery. I really appreciate that it can sound a bit sort of hug a tree or something, but I actually take it really seriously. I think there's something very necessary about being more than useful. That there's something very dark that happens when we just see people as expendable. You're just only as important as the job you can do. And so creativity and doing things not because you're good at them, not because you're gonna, it's irrelevant. It's nice to be good at the stuff we want to create, but it's not really the point. And finding ways to allow yourself to just be is really vital. And so I think Jung would talk about eros and libido. I have no idea. I'm more of a group analyst than a Jungian in terms of training, but that's what I think.
No, that's great. And then the other thing you mentioned was community.
Yeah. I guess this is the kind of group analytic bit of me, really, that I think people are inherently social. And one of the really striking aspects of my work, whether it's in any of the bits of clinical work I do or the reflective spaces that I run, is that people are really lonely often and feel very alone with their struggles with work. There's a lot of shame in it. Or there's a kind of, sometimes you get a bit of bravado kind of eye roll, like, typical NHS, blah, blah, blah. Well, that's kind of hiding in plain sight. Underneath that, there's something really despairing going on. If people really saw the loss and the sadness that healthcare professionals are carrying, that I think they might be quite shocked, actually, if people really saw it. I say people, I mean the kind of society at large. And I think we can't deny reality, that painful things are painful and difficult things are difficult. But we can bear witness to it. And I think the more people bear witness, the easier something is to not feel mad with it, to not feel alone with it. And it becomes survivable. I think community and groups, they can shame, but they can also take shame away. And shame really is about just being isolated with something, just thinking part of you is unacceptable, it shouldn't be there, it shouldn't exist. Again, it's very death mothery. It's somehow we're not supposed to. That bit's not human. So I think community is really vital as well. And for lots of healthcare professionals, their work is their community. And this is when it gets really, really complicated, that the banter that you get with your team, with the ward, there's often very dark humour, all that kind of stuff. And so if you've got this dilemma of should I stay or should I go, that's the main thing that people talk about that leave, actually, is the loss of that type of community. So how do we support the communities within the NHS better, but also how do we support people that leave through community as well?
And care was your third point.
I think there's something, then again, this kind of links to, I mean, it all links together. It's quite hard to separate them out, really. But there's something about really understanding that if we feel something, then it's human. And that's okay to talk about it. It's a sort of basic thing. And it's really important that we talk, and that when we talk, we experience someone on the other side that cares. They don't have to agree. They don't even have to understand. And again, community helps with this, because the more people you have in the room, more likely is you'll get at least one person that knows what you're saying. But we need to learn to care and expect care, and for that care to not be conditional on being tidied up. You have to present it in a particular way. You know, it has to come pre-packaged or with the right sort of joke. Like you can just arrive, and it will be there. But the only way, this is all sort of cycles back really, but the only way we can be authentic with offering care is also being authentic with offering limits. Mm-hmm. You know, it might not be that everybody gets enough care in any given experience. It might not, you know, that you have to kind of, you have to try and give care consciously.
And Livy, the last point was choice.
I think we're in a world that very necessarily and very importantly is grappling with ideas of power at the moment, and who has choice and who doesn't have choice. I guess there's something in me that likes to kind of qualify that a bit, in that it actually, most of us we may not have great choices, but we probably always do have a choice. And some people have a lot more choices than others. And it can be really, when we have less power in a situation and we're shrouded in shame, it can feel very, very difficult to know what choices we have. And they can become quite black or white, stay or go. Or, you know, I have to stay. I mean, you often hear that, like, I can't leave on time, I have to go. I can't do this, I have to. And I don't really have a straightforward answer to kind of what people should do with their choices. But just it's really vital that gets part of this conversation. Where is the choice? What's our relationship with choice? How much choice do we have? And you know, what's real? What is actually real?
I suppose just thinking about some of the stuff going on in the world around, you know, abortion and choices around, you know, what happens to your bodies, and I guess, you know, thinking about people's experiences through the pandemic, and again, choices around risks that people are exposed to. So I suppose my mind has gone to times when choice feels like it's taken away from people in relation to the power that is operating, and how traumatic that is, not only in terms of the internal conflict of that, but the real world consequences of that.
Yeah. And there's the death mother archetype, you know, in her more kind of sort of more shocking story incarnations. You've got stories like Medea, who is a woman in a story who chooses to kill her children. And a more recent version would be Toni Morrison's Beloved, which is an extraordinary story that is really... it's got elements of Medea in it, but also a woman who's been enslaved and abused. It's just horrific. And again, she chooses to kill her children rather than have them be put into that system of abuse. These are terrible choices. They're terrible choices. And I suppose from a psychoanalytic perspective, it's about the importance of making them consciously. rather than trying to pretend anything is nice, anything is uncomplicated, trying to reserve judgment on ourselves and other people, which again is the care and the community, people are faced with terrible choices, and if we don't hold them consciously and really understand that part of mothering actually is death, and that we might not like that as an idea. It might feel disgusting, it might feel like we just really repulsed, we want to keep away from it. But unless we understand that that is really a part of mothering, the things that we do to each other and our communities and our societies and our countries is so much worse, you know. So we either have death in mothering, or we live a death mother archetype, which is horrifying. And the most horrifying aspect of it to me is that we say it's nice, we say it's love, we say it's care.
That makes me think of the trickiness around the kind of clap for carers, and just, you know, this kind of real range of emotions people I've experienced in that. And
I think that's a perfect embodiment, actually, and also why community is so important, because, you know, part of the thing that I love about story and reflective practice is not about holding one interpretation and saying that's the truth. We need to understand there's lots of choices in our stories, there's lots of interpretations. So clap for carers, for some parts of community, it would have been a way of saying thank you. It would have been a way of saying pride, of trying to show support. It would have been profoundly important to do that, and maybe profoundly important to receive it. You know, as a healthcare professional, you need some kind of exchange to go on, but it can very quickly also be experienced as a silencing. As a, you can't complain, you have to, you're supposed to be okay, it's supposed to be nice, going in to a place where you could die. And the stories at the beginning, you know, where, like, I mean, we still don't really know what was going on, but the beginning, like, really, it could have been walking to death. And for some people that was true, that was realised as well. And being clapped on your way is just like, my God. And to be the person who clapped is also, oh my God, what did I just clap? And then, of course, there's the people that didn't clap, that stood in silence or protested in different ways. And we need lots of different voices to be heard, so that we can have our experiences validated, so we can see that we have choice, that we're not alone with something, that chances are someone will understand. The shame will be dispersed, either of wanting the clapping, like you might be in a certain group, like everyone's saying clapping's awful, and you're like, oh my God, I liked it. And then there's another group that might be saying, you know, clapping's, you know, amazing, and you're like, I didn't want to be clapped to my death, like, no.
And I guess for some people that'll be feeling both of those at the same time, loving it and hating it.
Yeah, which I think is probably most, actually. And which makes this stuff so complicated. There's a phrase that I really like that says, what's out there is in here, as in inside myself, is back then, as in the past. So whatever I'm drawing my attention to in the outside world is something that resonates with me in my internal world, which is going to be linked to something in my experience, either directly in my family experience or in my the socialising processes that I experienced growing up.
So Libby, if people want to find out more about your groups and about the work that you do,
so I have a website, www.libbynugent.co.uk, and I have a blog on there as well where I kind of jot down thoughts, and sometimes I like to talk and I like to write, and so they're quite long. But I put ideas down. So, and there's an events page, and people can just come along. Actually, everybody's welcome. The groups are they're not massive. They're kind of between kind of 5 and 12 people normally, that kind of space. So it's try to create not too big, so there's space for people to talk.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please do share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. I'd love to connect with you, so do come and find me on LinkedIn or Twitter. You can also sign up to my mailing list to keep up to date with future episodes and get useful psychology advice and tips straight to your inbox. All the links are in the show notes. Thanks again, and until next time, take good care.